Thank you so much for taking some time out of your afternoon to join us today for this session on refugees' rights and protection through the perspective of faith. My name's Huda, Alawa, and I'm very pleased, honored, excited to be moderating this panel today with some incredible panelists. So today, UNHCR estimates that there are over 120 million people who have been forcibly displaced due to persecution, conflict, violence, and human rights violations around the world. To put that into context, that's 1 in every 69 people, and that's been doubled in the last 10 years. So this is a very significant increase, and we're seeing that there's a need now more than ever to engage and respond for the rights of refugees. So I'm pleased today to really be joined by a group of inspirational change makers from all walks of life who are actively engaging, advocating, and responding to the needs of those displaced. Over the next 90 minutes or so, we will have an engaging conversation to learn about the work that they're each leading, learn about the aspects of faith and refugee engagement, and hear about the challenges and hopes and dreams ahead. So I'll just start with a quick introduction on everyone. So joining us today from this side is Manoel Moraes, coordinator of the Sergio Vieira de Mello chair at the State University of Para. Apologies, Portuguese is not my strong suit. We also have Mohamed Abouasekar, senior partnerships officer at UNHCR. We have Thiago Biazin at Barnabas Aid Brazil. To my right is Christina Tobias-Nahi, Director of Public Affairs at Islamic Relief USA, and last but not least, Raphael Marcus, Chief Programs Officer at HIAS. So welcome to all of my panelists. And just a bit about the format today, we'll have some questions on our end prepared, have some discussion, and then we'll open it up to the floor and to those who are virtual for any questions that you may have. So we really welcome any hearty discussions and audience participation. So I'll jump right into it and actually ask each of my panelists to share a little bit about themselves, to introduce themselves and the work that they lead, and how faith plays a role in that. So Manoel, if we can start with you.
Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Sou Manoel Moraes, sou professor na Universidade no estado do Pará, na Amazônia brasileira, o estado onde acontecerá a COP, e também coordenador da Cátedra Sergio Vieira de Mello, a cátedra para assuntos de refugiado, tráfico humanos, sobretudo na demanda entre Belém e Ilha do Marajó. Quero agradecer aos patrocinadores, aos organizadores do evento. Importante essas interlocuções, porque cada fala também é um compromisso, cada fala é um acordo, cada fala é uma política, né, de reconhecimento e de respeitabilidade às alteridades religiosas. Bem, quero avançar agora de uma maneira rápida sobre os tópicos. O primeiro é que as migrações, o humano, da arqueologia política contemporânea, o humano é um ente de migração. O Estado Nacional foi uma barreira a um fato que sempre aconteceu. O ser humano, ele é um ente migratório. E a migração sempre sofreu problema na criação dos sistemas imperiais, étnicos e nacionais, que houve impedimento dessas travessias, dessas caminhadas pelo globo, né? E também temos a incapacidade, outro aspecto antropológico, a incapacidade do ser humano entender-se como um ente natural, né? E também como um ente em reconhecimento como humano, né? Há sempre, nas concepções étnicas de auto-humanidade, sempre uma hiper-humanidade em relação ao outro. Isso é um fato etnocêntrico que acontece em todo o globo. É um desafio. E o quarto tópico são as crenças ontológicas dos povos, que é algo fundamental para entender as suas ações morais, os seus direitos também e as suas concepções de dignidade. Outros tópicos também que eu colocaria é que nos demanda as cátedras o reconhecimento do fato diaspórico dos coletivos americanos, a América, desde o Alasca até a Terra do Fogo, no sul do Chile e da Argentina, é marcada pelas questões diaspóricas, sob diversas situações. E temos as crises causadas pelo adoecimento da produção e do modelo capitalista de produção, de circulação, e impactar diretamente o processo migratório. O não reconhecimento do direito dos povos, numa concepção liberal, da dignidade cidadã global, numa concepção republicana, e das dignidades corporais, coletivas e ambientais de coletivos ancestrais. Esses são os maiores desafios nossos hoje. Entender a América Latina, que é o desafio da nossa cátedra, é entender que, desde a época pré-colonial, é bom entender que a antropização, a presença humana na Amazônia, data de 12 mil anos atrás, ao mesmo tempo em que começamos a situação de normalização ambiental e de relevo na Amazônia. Então, nos estudos arqueológicos feitos, a Amazônia ela foi polinizada, ela foi ampliada com essas presenças humanas animistas, né, desses povos ancestrais. Isso nós temos nos nossos museus. Então, essa circulação sempre foi importante nessas demandas pré-coloniais. Nas diásporas forçadas pós-coloniais, nós tivemos aí já endossada pelo abrutamento das formas produtivas escravocratas e também incentivado pelas questões mercantis. E isso aconteceu a despeito de qualquer sistema de valor. A Amazônia é um mix de populações, né? Nós vamos ter aqui sefaditas, árabes, afrodiaspóricos, diversos lugares da Amazônia, navegantes italianos, veroneses. A Amazônia é um ambiente rico de diversidades étnicas, além dos seus povos ameríndios, que muitas vezes foram forçados a deslocamento por causa dessas diásporas e dessas ocupações coloniais. Vamos ver se eu falo isso tudo em 5 minutos. Hoje esse é o nosso desafio colonial, em que a América do Sul, na parte do norte, nós temos uma ampliação desses movimentos migratórios. Eu não sei onde é que tem luz aqui, eu acho que não tem. Dessa parte diaspórica, a Venezuela, o Haiti, né, a República Dominicana e também alguns países da África, há um processo migratório muito grande para a Amazônia e da Amazônia para o sul do Brasil e Uruguai, como estava conversando com o nosso colega ali. E isso tem causado, causa também de ampliação da produção mineral. Isso também é uma questão também de opressão aos povos ancestrais, pela ampliação territorial e também pela rigidez do controle de território. Então, quem sempre foi andante pela Amazônia agora não pode ser, e muitas dessas populações amazônicas, com diversas línguas, pouco têm noção do que é o direito territorial, o que é o espaço territorial, e agora são desafiados a pensar dessa maneira, só que de uma maneira já armamentícia. Então, quem era habitante tradicional se vê em condições de guerras pelo tráfico, guerras militares por ocupação territorial. Um dos motivos sobre essas demandas migratórias, então vou passar ao quadro, é a produção agrícola, é a produção mineral, né? É a expulsão imobiliária dos povos ancestrais, é isso aqui que a gente vê que está sendo desnorteado, e o nosso desafio é pensar a reestruturação dos direitos sociais, dos direitos constitucionais, dos direitos civis para o reconhecimento contínuo de inclusão aos imigrantes como cidadãos globais. Muito obrigado, desculpa pelo avanço do tempo.
Thank you very much for that and for adding the context on Latin American migration here. This is very helpful for us to be framing the conversation with. So I'd actually like to shift now to Mohammed, if you can give us a bit of the global context on refugees today, and from there we'll hear more about the work that organizations are doing on the ground.
Thank you, Huda, and thank you everybody for your interest in this session. My name is Mohammed Abu Asakar. I work for United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as a Senior Partnerships and Philanthropy Officer. When it comes to refugees and the role of faith, I remember a story of a young girl. Her name is Amal. Amal means hope. A Syrian refugee in the east of Lebanon. I met her 10 years ago. And she was living with her four sisters, with two of her paralyzed parents in a makeshift tent. That girl kept smiling the whole hour we spent with her. That shocked me to the level that it triggered me to ask her the question, what keeps you smiling? Living in a makeshift tent that is a very, very miserable situation. And she said a very powerful word. She said, because God exists, that gives me hope. So that shows the level of faith within refugees. Amal is one of 120 million people, of refugees, internally displaced people, asylum seekers, and stateless live in the world. We look into the five main countries that host and produce refugees. We look into Venezuela, Ukraine, Syria, Sudan, and Myanmar as the main producers of those refugees around the world. And where refugees go, the vast majority of refugees go to neighboring countries. And they are hosted in countries that have middle or low income. That those countries face a pressure in their economy. And this is like another level of burden on their infrastructure. And when we look into the type of people who are fled as refugees, 75% of refugees are women and children. And that makes them very vulnerable in so many different ways. And what they need everything, from protection to shelter to water to education to health to all types of services. When those host countries suffer from challenges facing their people, then we start to hear a new nuances and narrative of anti-refugees kind of sentiments. And this is something that UNHCR is working so hard with faith-based leaders to address. We believe in the importance of the role of faith-based leaders because of the mandate that UNHCR stands for, which is finding solutions for refugees. As long as we provide ongoing humanitarian assistance to keep those people alive, it's always in the back of our head to keep and provide durable solutions. Unfortunately, every year, only 1% of those refugees find solutions in a resettlement pathways. 99% remain where they are. When we see refugees in camps, that is only 15% of the refugee population. 85% of refugees live in urban settings that we don't see. The cameras cannot capture them. And they need to be hosted within host communities. They need to be welcomed within host communities. And in order to do that in a very meaningful way, there is a very important role that faith-based organizations need to work hand in hand within UNHCR to advocate for welcoming opportunities for refugees. Brazil is a very great example of providing an example of Operation Welcome. Operation Welcome is at a government level of providing pathways for refugees. Just last of the Operation Welcome, Brazil provided 11,000 humanitarian visas to Afghan refugees. That's in addition to Syrian refugees and Ukrainian refugees. This is an example that we would like to see in so many different parts of the world. Operation Welcome, that's not only at the state level, but integrated within the community. Thank you very much, and we'll continue the discussion.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thiago, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Thiago Biazin. I'm head of operations for Barnabas Aid in Brazil. Barnabas is a Christian organization that works with the suffering church. We work with churches that need help all around the world. How we do that? From Christians, through Christians, for Christians. And we also have work with refugees. One example, we were the first organization to get in contact with the government Brazilian for the refugees, for the Afghan refugees. After our contact, the government reacted and the humanitarian visa was released. So we brought 26 families of Christian Afghans to Brazil that they were adopted by local churches, that they supplied all their needs. So we brought them, we hosted them, and now a couple weeks ago I spoke with one pastor and he said all of them are working, they are all learning Portuguese, and they are all developing in Brazil. So they are getting they are adapting here and get used to the country as well. Another thing, we have seen the rise of the number of refugees as the violence against Christians is rising incredibly. For example, in Nigeria, an estimated 45,000 Christians have been killed in the Islamist violence across the northern and middle belt of Nigeria since 2009. On Democratic Republic of Congo, an estimated 5,500 Christians have lost their life to Islamic State affiliate militants since October 2017. Nagorno-Karabakh, since September 2023, around 120,000, including 30,000 children, have fled from Nagorno-Karabakh to seek refuge in Armenia. The Nagorno-Karabakh region has been populated by Armenians who accept Christ in 301 after Christ for at least 2,500 years. Under the Soviet rule, it was governed as an independent oblast with the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic, and was incorporated into the Republic of Azerbaijan at the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So we have seen the need for help the refugees. We are helping refugees from Ukraine that fled for the neighboring countries. We are helping the churches that are receiving them, give them food, give them money to pay the bills for the church, for the electricity, heat, and all the charges that they need because of the rise of the number of people. Most of them stay in the churches. So we have been experiencing a lot of challenging regarding refugees, and the number of displaced people is rising, especially Christians being forced to flee because of the violence, because of the war, and because of intolerance. So we face a big challenge, and a panel like this is really good for us to talk and to see how each one can help each other to get a common sense and talk about tolerance, talk about respecting the other beliefs, respecting the other freedoms, and the right they have to believe, and the freedom they have to believe in what they want. So that's what Barnabas does, and that's one thing of Barnabas. What we do is about the refugees. We do a lot more, but we are focusing on the refugees here. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that and for telling us more about what Barnabas stands for and how you're advocating for those persecuted based on religion. So Christina from Islamic Relief USA, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. So happy to be here, and thank you to those online as well. I want to thank especially the IF20 for always keeping refugees top and foremost on their agenda every year when we have these convenings. So Islamic Relief USA is one of the offices, national entities of the Islamic Relief Federated family. Like Barnabas as well, you know, we have a much larger portfolio across the globe than just refugees. We were actually started over 40 years ago in the food and security space around some of the Africa famines. We became very strong in the sector of WASH, so water, sanitation, and health, and that led us to do a lot of work with refugees in camp management, especially like after Darfur in Sudan. And most recently, we have actually begun to do reception and resettlement in the United States as well over the last decade. And so refugees has become a large part of our priorities and portfolios. Interestingly, I wanted to refer folks to a research study first before I actually begin my topic that came out just 2 days ago from the Pew Research organization. So you can find this at pewresearch.org. And it's on refugees and religion, and their analysis is that religion and migration are closely connected. Religious affiliation can influence whether people leave home, where they move, and how they're received when they arrive. So Islamic Relief, knowing that even before this research study came out, actually worked on our own guidance document, and I have a couple of copies in paper I'm happy to share, as well as we have it online, around the rights of forced migrants within our faith tradition, looking at Scripture. So I just want to pull out a few of those verses and explain them a little bit. Now, the challenge then, and I think we heard this in the plenary even earlier, is how you take the Scripture and what's within your faith tradition and you adapt that to modern challenges, which I think we won't have time in the 3 minutes left. So Islam has a strong heritage of forced migrant protection, stemming from the original teachings of the Quran, the Holy Book, as well as from historical examples taken from the lives of the great prophets. It even has stern commands on the importance of seeking refuge if one is facing persecution, as well as the duty of providing asylum to those who need it. So both the rights of those who are departing and the duties incumbent on the host populations receiving them. So if I can go back a little bit in history, some of this comes in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, who was, the last prophet believed in within our faith tradition, and he and 100 of his companions were persecuted and had to seek refuge. And they actually sought that in an interfaith way with the Christian king Negus. And so that's kind of where some of this context is taken with. And then about a decade later, a much larger group of them also migrated to Medina. So on this, there's actually a fun fact. I'm not sure if everyone knows, but we obviously have the Western calendar. But within the Islamic faith, sometimes you will see that there is also an Islamic calendar. Does anyone know what the Islamic calendar started with? It is not the birth of the Prophet. Anyone know the date of the beginning of that calendar? So, fun fact, so the Islamic calendar did not begin with the birth of the Prophet, even when the revelation was revealed, but it actually began with this migration. And that is a fun fact. So, you're gonna stress me with the time clock here. So one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize today, because we kept hearing throughout the last few days around this term, at least in English, I don't know how it translates in Portuguese and other languages, this concept of forced migration. But within the Islamic tradition and within the Arabic, this concept of force is not used as much because we do not want to imply that they are a helpless victim of circumstance, but rather someone who has taken an active choice to preserve their life, as per the command of God. This understanding confers more agency and dignity upon these people and their families. And there's a Quranic verse, as I mentioned, I would give some scripture, that the persecuted are not only promised a safe refuge if they seek it, but that they will also find lands of plenty. So if we move from maybe just another minute or two, from the departing to the receiving, we have verses as well that say, if any one of them should seek protection, grant it to him so that he may hear the word of God, and then take him to a safe place for him. And so there's a lot of commandments around the duty of not only protecting and giving safe conduct, but once these people have arrived, that you must treat them as if they are citizens within your land, and that gives them inherent equal protections, including protections of not being returned to their countries of origin, the right to dignity, the right to freedom of religion, because there's also compulsory for the state actors and the state authorities to protect even non-Muslims who are in need of sanctuary that would come into these lands. Again, all of their physical needs, food, shelter, clothing, economic livelihood, protecting of their property that they might come with, as well as very strong commandments and rights around non-separation of family, and that it is actually a sin to separate family members. So running out of time, I hope that we'll have more time, a little bit more, to get into this document and some of the historic and theological pinnings of this. But again, the challenge then is to take these rights and the dignity that's conferred on these people, and how do you put it into practical application today in the modern world with all the challenges and lack of political will.
Thank you, Christina. We will definitely have more time to discuss this. Raphael Marcus from HIAS.
Yeah, thank you, Huda. Thank you all for being here, and it's wonderful to be here. And like Christina, I also applaud the fact that we find space in our dense agenda to highlight the relationship of faith with refugees and to highlight the issue of refugees. So HIAS, formerly known as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, we stand for a world where refugees find welcome, safety, and opportunity. And we do that by drawing on our Jewish values and on our Jewish history. And so when we talk about how the faith guides us, it has to do both. It has to do both with our religion itself, but also with our experience and our history. HIAS started in the 1880s. So it's a very old, we tend to say it's the oldest refugee agency, and we are the global Jewish refugee agency. But when we started, we really started off with helping only Jews. That was throughout the programs, the world wars, and so on. But in 1990s or towards the 2000, HIAS really realized that there weren't so many Jews left anymore that needed help, and there's a place for Jews also to go. And so HIAS started to branch out and to just basically help all refugees, no matter where they come from, who they are, what they believe in, and so on. We are a resettlement agency, but we also work in humanitarian settings. We provide services in mental health and psychosocial support, legal protection, economic inclusion, and prevention and response to gender-based violence. And one really important part of that is it is really about access to rights. It is not only about getting the right. Once you have a right to do something, it does not say that you have access to rights. And that's the really important part also of xenophobia, right? You can have maybe a work permit, but you still have to find work. And to find work as a refugee or an asylum seeker in certain countries is not always an easy thing. And that is something that we always keep front and center of our minds. It is not only about reaching a situation where they have the right, but where they can actually access the right. Now, how does faith really inform us? So on the religion side or the scripture side, it really starts off the first Jew, Abraham. His whole story is defined by migration, both forced migration and not forced migration. And he really experiences the trials and the vulnerability of migration that haven't really changed a lot over the last 1,000 years. And so I think that's a major point also to realize. When we do advocacy, for example, we know from Jewish religion that morality trumps over law. And so that is where we get our inspiration also for advocacy. There might be a law, but if it's morally wrong, then you have to change the law. And when it comes to the programming itself and everything we do, I mean, you know, it says 36 times in the Torah that you should welcome the stranger. And Jewish commentators will agree that this is not because it is the most important thing to do, but it is probably one of the most difficult things to do. And so that is how the scripture and religion really informs us. But the history also informs us. We've gone through a long history as a people of forced migration, and you know, the fact that we are now helping all refugees is basically a continuation of our history, right? We had a history of ourselves being on the road all the time. We helped, as an organization, Jewish people finding safety, and now we are able to do that for everyone else. We tend to say that once we helped refugees because they were Jewish, nowadays we do it because we are Jewish, because it is really part of our values and of our religion. Important part for us in programming, which we also draw from our history, is it's not so much important that we are a faith-based organization. It's really important that we are a faith-sensitive organization. As Mohammed has already very well said, the spiritual needs are such an important part of your resilience, and that, you know, I strongly believe that the Jewish people have survived, partly, if not in totality, because of their belief, of the religion, of the unity, and what it provided to them. And that is really important. And so as an example, for example, in Chad, we worked with Darfurians. Unfortunately, I'm now stating the work we did over 20 years ago, but we are currently again in a place where we're helping the same people. One thing that we realized very quickly there was that it was very hard for them to get over the trauma, but one part that was really missing for them is they were not able to really bury their loved ones in the way that they would usually do in accordance with their faith tradition. And so that is one example of how we would have faith sensitivity. And last thing is we also engage with the Jewish community. So there's the commandment or how the religion guides us. There's how the history and the experience guides us. But there's also how the people right now guide us. And that is our constituency. These are the people that help us, if it is by welcoming, receiving refugees, housing them, or helping us with the advocacy. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Raphael, and really appreciate everyone setting the scene and how faith is informing the work that you're doing. Before we go to audience questions, I do just have one more question, a couple more questions that we wanted to share as well. And I think Raphael and you and Christina have touched, actually all of you have sort of touched on at times that this work can be very complex and challenging. And so many times we have many different constituents, communities, those we're serving that we're navigating and supporting in these roles. So I'd be curious to hear if you can share a bit about the challenges that you faced as a faith actor or as a non-faith actor working with faith-based organizations, and what solutions you found so far. We won't solve the whole world today. I wish we could, but very curious to hear from that. Who would like to go first? Raphael?
Sure, gladly. How many minutes do we have? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Oh, okay. 2 minutes for the challenges is not is a challenge. Look, I will say that whatever challenges we have does not stand for whatever challenges faith actors have. I think one important part that I always want to say that when we talk about faith-based organizations is we are as diverse as the non-faith-based organizations. And so we deal with diverse challenges. One big challenge that we are seeing, and that's not necessarily for HIAS, but for faith actors itself, and we're working on that, is faith actors don't always have the tools to engage in I'm talking about the humanitarian sector, for example, in terms of the jargon, in terms of having the capacity. They are not necessarily structured the way that the humanitarian system is structured according to sectors and clusters. But there's also a certain amount of mistrust sometimes about faith actors. And it goes also the other way around. And so we are actively working actually in partnership with Islamic Relief and with the Lutheran World Federation in order to create guidance notes for both, for the faith actors in terms of making sure that they understand what are the humanitarian principles, how is the humanitarian system structured, but also for non-faith-based actors to make them understand, for example, what is faith sensitivity. That does not mean that you become impartial or, to take away the mistrust that if you do faith-sensitive program, for example, in mental health, this is not about preaching any sort of religion, which would then obviously fall completely out of the humanitarian principles. So this mistrust, I think, is very strong. In working with other faith actors, it is also not always easy to navigate cultural and religious norms. So, for example, faith actors sometimes might struggle to separate religious issues from cultural norms. For example, when you talk about early marriage, that is something which is not always easy when you engage with faith actors. So that is one thing. But I will also say, and to be a bit more reflective, also internally, we have to make sure that our staff is faith sensitive. So on the human resources side, it requires ongoing training. And we engage with all kinds of faith, right? So we work in Chad, that is predominantly Muslim. We work in Ukraine, that is predominantly Christian. We work in so many different ways with so many different faiths. So it is also the internal struggle, not only external, but also internal, to make sure that we have the capacity and that we retain that faith sensitivity to make sure that we can really provide the best services.
Yeah, thank you. So Islamic Relief, similar to HIAS, works with all cultures and ethnicities and genders and religions in the delivery of our services around the globe. So really the focus is on those who are most vulnerable and those who are in need. But that being said, yeah, I would agree with Raphael that, in those contexts, obviously we feel especially culturally relevant and able to do the sensitivity when we're working within the Muslim populations, and have to have that nuance when we're working with other populations that we serve both globally and a lot in the U.S. as well. We do a lot of disaster response and delivery of services in the U.S., and predominantly our beneficiaries are not Muslim, and so how to navigate that. In the larger sphere, I would say, the challenge we grapple with the most, and I already said political will earlier, and that's, our challenge to all of us, and that we will give back as a recommendation to the G20, certainly. We have what we call the 3 Ps, and we kind of state that those are politics, policy, and phobias. And with a name like Islamic Relief, certainly we face Islamophobia in many of the contexts and countries where we work, especially in some of the European countries as well as the US. And as an entity that is pursuing becoming in its own right a refugee reception and resettlement agency, as I mentioned, in the long history of those agencies in the US as they exist now, HIAS, I believe, was the first. If I'm not mistaken, they're over 100 years old. There are 9 current resettlement agencies, and I'm going to be speaking of the context in the US, and they are all Christian, Jewish, and secular. And even though the majority at this point in history of refugees coming in are Muslim, there isn't an actual agency with that reference as their guide. And so we have been working for a number of years to enter that space with all the particular challenges that presents with disinformation in media and Islamophobia. But I think that is one of our biggest challenges.
If I may add, there were 9 refugee resettlement agencies. By now there are 10 because another Christian organization was accepted. In total, 7 out of the 10 are faith-based, but we are obviously missing one really important faith.
Would you like to go next?
Yeah, as a Christian organization, one of the challenges we face is the rise of the number of the refugees around the world. Basically, Christians fleeing from violence, wars, conflicts, and intolerance. We have, for example, in 2021, the village of Huda in the state of Plateau in Nigeria was attacked by terrorists. And they killed around 30 to 40 people. And the people that survived had to flee. But each house in Huda was hosting between 16 and 27 individuals that fled from another village that was attacked a couple weeks before. And when they attacked the villages, they burned down everything that had left. So the people had nowhere to go back. They have no house to go back, nothing to go back for. So that's one of the biggest challenges we are facing, is that the rise of the violence against Christians is producing an enormous number of refugees, Christian refugees that are fleeing to another countries, to another place, or even internal displacement. And we have Myanmar that have a lot of Christians that were displaced, not once, but we have people that have fled more than 4 times. They were attacked in the refugee camps by the Tatmadaw. So that's, we have been facing this. We, as an organization that help the Christians, we face the challenge to help everyone, but not being able to do it, so.
Please, if you have anything to share, Manoel.
Tudo é muito complexo, falar em pouco tempo é muito difícil, mas eu não falo em nome da minha preferência religiosa. Eu vou falar em nome da universidade, do governo do estado do Pará, né? A cátedra Sergio Vieira de Mello, ligado à ACNUR e exercida no Pará, tem as suas circunstâncias próprias, culturais, étnicas, que favorece uma interlocução acolhedora de um modo muito positivo, mas tendo que regulamentar juridicamente essas recepções dos imigrantes. Por quê? Entendemos, a cátedra na universidade entende, que a migração não é só um nome, não é somente um comportamento, mas são corpos. E esses corpos que trazem memória de seus ambientes anímicos, né? Corpos que trazem afetos, traumas e dores. Corpos que têm suas línguas, seus modos de pensar e devem, para a negociação de sua recepção, pensar em outra língua, pensar em outro sistema legal. Então, a nossa cátedra, ela sugere modificações, inclusive, em leis municipais do Estado, com sucesso, para que tenhamos um acolhimento dessa alteridade. É difícil trabalhar alteridade, mas ela é importante para que façamos um postulado, a palavra postulado é difícil, mas um postulado das relações. Então, seria o respeito, não tolerância, respeito, seria a inclusão deles e a legalização de cidadania deles. Só rapidamente, tem uma expressão que eu acho muito bonita de um historiador chamado Scholem, Gershon Scholem, que ele fala sobre os justos. Os justos são aqueles que não conhecemos, mas que eles sustentam o ordenamento do planeta. Então, fica a nossa sugestão. Muito obrigado.
Thank you so much, and maybe Mohammed, UNHCR, you can finalize this one comment, and then we'll open the floor for some questions.
Thank you very much, Huda. So I don't want to talk about challenges per se, but maybe to give some hope. And this is the question that we always been asked. So United Nations is a secular organization. So how come you work with faith-based organizations? So this is a very fundamental question. The fact there are so many reasons for that. The magnitude and the landscape of refugee today is beyond one organization's capacity. It's even beyond a government capacity. So we have to join forces all together to make that difference. The fact that all refugees, all prophets were refugees is not a coincidence. There is a reason for that we all need to embrace. When 80% of the world population are faith affiliates, that is very reasonable foundation that UNHCR need to engage with faith-based organizations. Another reason is that faith-based organizations, they have the expertise in a humanitarian response. For any disaster, wherever it happens, mosques, churches, synagogues, temples are the first responders. So they have this expertise in a humanitarian response. When the COVID happens and all the whole world been challenged about, shall I take the vaccine, shall I not take the vaccine? So where they go? To faith-based organizations to get the answer because of the trust and accountability. So that accountability we need for the faith-based organizations to deliver in terms of embracing refugees within the community. Another reason is the solutions. And the solutions that at the government level and even with the community, we need to advocate. This policy is very important that UNHCR cannot do it alone. We need to join forces with everybody and with faith-based organizations can help mobilize this advocacy part. And this all work that we are trying to do within the faith-based organizations, we take it into the biggest challenge that the most sophisticated rules within kind of finance is the Islamic. So the Islamic finance is very complicated for so many different reasons. And UNHCR took the challenge and established the first of its kind Islamic philanthropy program that's been engaging with Muslim organizations on some sophisticated issues like zakat, because we need to address it to the 40% of refugees who are Muslims. Not only that, but we engage with all other types of faiths because we would like to have Jewish philanthropy, Christian philanthropy, Hindu philanthropy, because without that, we will leave people behind. And we don't want to leave people behind. So this is why we come join forces to mobilize with all these organizations so we can keep the hope and resilience of refugees alive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think we'll open the floor for any questions. We'll take a few questions and then open it for our panelists. So why don't you hand it to the front?
Hi. One of the biggest issues regarding refugees is the difficulty they have to transition from receiving humanitarian assistance to develop self-reliance, self-sufficiency, right? How are you, the faith-based organizations, doing or planning to do to promote self-reliance on those refugees you are taking care of now?
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah.
Thank you very much for all the remarks. My name is Renata Barrampur, and I am a member of the Baha'i community of Brazil. I'm also a daughter of a Iranian man who came to Brazil as a refugee due to religious persecution in Iran. At that moment, during the 80s, Baha'is were being hundreds of Baha'is were executed, and there were lots of human rights violations going on. And to this moment, there is also many other acts of persecution happening against Baha'is. And 30 years later, here I am, trying to bring some Iranian Baha'is from Iran to seek refuge in Brazil too. The thing is, the challenges that I've been seeing is that there is a huge burden on NGOs in this matter. And most part of them are like in the midst of lots of work and trying to bring more refugees due to many reasons, of course. But I see that there is a support from the Brazilian state, as Mr. Mohammed mentioned, regarding offering visas and this kind of stuff. but not in terms of policy that effective support refugees and staying in a country, in a new country. So my question is, how can we engage states not only in providing visas to refugee people seekers, but also in creating programs or public policies that effective support refugees living in a new country in a way that may relieve the work or the burden over the NGOs?
Boa tarde, eu vou fazer minha pergunta em português. Meu nome é Álvaro, eu sou do Uruguai e eu estudo na universidade a migração latino-americana. Então eu entendo que com pouco tempo para falar, os temas são bem amplos. Eu queria focalizar nas crianças, que atualmente é o meu tema de estudo. Quando eu penso na frase não deixar ninguém para trás, na minha mente vem a imagem daqueles que fazem a travessia do Selva do Dairen, por exemplo, ou aqueles cubanos ou venezuelanos que atravessam o Brasil para chegar no meu país, no Uruguai. E desse grupo vulnerável, eu penso nas crianças, que são as que, na minha mente, ficam para trás, literalmente, mas também ficam para trás porque eles não fazem parte da decisão de sair de seu lugar de origem. Eles ficam para trás porque são os que mais sofrem com o trauma da migração. Eles ficam para trás porque vem quebrada a sua trajetória educativa com a experiência da migração. E eles ficam para trás por muitos assuntos. Então, eu gostaria de saber de vocês, especificamente, como está sendo o seu trabalho com essa população de crianças refugiadas e imigrantes. Muito obrigado.
Boa tarde a todas as pessoas. Só um pouquinho. Eu sou Flávia Lemos, sou professora de Psicologia Social e Política na Universidade Federal do Pará. Eu gostaria de saber se vocês e as organizações que vocês representam têm um trabalho também de educação em direitos humanos das próprias comunidades que vocês representam, porque é importante a gente também pensar que há uma contradição, né? As mesmas organizações e as mesmas religiões que podem apoiar, muitas vezes também, elas são aquelas que violentam, produzem genocídios, massacres, que vulnerabilizam essas pessoas que vão estar à mercê da violação forçada, fugindo da religiosidade moral, diferente da religião e os princípios éticos, né, que protegem. Como que vocês têm trabalhado nesse sentido? Porque aqui no Brasil, por exemplo, recentemente tivemos, né, um governo autoritário que, inclusive, queria perseguir pessoas que não tinham religião ou que eram de outras religiões e queria meio que proclamar o Estado teocrático, quando ele mesmo não tinha nenhum exemplo minimamente ético dos princípios mais básicos da fé, a qual ele dizia pertencer, que, de fato, ele negava todos os princípios básicos, né? E nós estamos, inclusive, né, reconstruindo agora essas ações, essas políticas públicas, porque o ódio que ele disseminou, né, e fez sair diretamente dos armários, manipulando a fé das pessoas, foi atroz para a população brasileira. Então, eu aproveito aqui, né, para fazer um brado à democracia e que as nossas fés, nossos princípios, em nenhum modo sejam ultrajantes da fé e dos princípios das outras pessoas, inclusive daquelas que não querem ter fé, e que respeitem os princípios da laicidade no diálogo interreligioso. Muito obrigada.
Hello, I'm Mary Carmen. I'm from the Organization of American States. First, thank you, Raphael, for mentioning access to rights, because normally haven't heard a lot of people mentioning outside of myself. So it's great, because it really puts into context a lot of the work that we do when you talk about it. And then to Christina, very quickly, your final comment, and what does political will look like in terms of very practical things that could make your life and your work easier for you or anybody else in the table?
I think we might start with those questions because it's quite a few now, and then we'll open it up afterwards. So I'll give panelists 3 minutes each, or 2 minutes each to answer those initial ones. And Thiago, I think you wanted to go first already. So.
Yeah, I want to answer your question. And I'll say as an organization, the experience we are having. When the Taliban took over on August 15, it was a Sunday. On Monday, August 16, we got in contact with the government, the former government. On September 3rd, there was an interministerial ordinance was issued guaranteeing humanitarian visa for the Afghan refugees. Okay, and Mohammed said that the number of refugees from Afghanistan that come to Brazil. When we had the change of the government, the visas stopped for 90 days. And after that, they started issuing the visas again, but now the ordinance was suspended. No Afghan that want to come to Brazil will have the right to get a humanitarian visa, and this was done by this government. I have 11 Nigerians. 4 of them are girls from Chibok. In 2014, the Boko Haram kidnapped 276 girls. I am trying to talk with the government over 1 year, and I have no response of any kind of visa for them. So that's the experience we are having regarding the government. Thank you.
Any takers for next, Raphael? Oh.
Sure. So I will start with the question about self-reliance. It's a great question. I think, first of all, the access to rights is a big part of that, especially when it comes to employment, because that's a major part of it, and legal protection for sure. But the other part is also working with the host communities. There's a very interesting data we just got from interviews that we did with welcome circles, which are host communities in the US that receive refugees. And in those interviews, we really figured out that the work has strengthened the civil fabric of the host communities, because also they engage with different faith organizations in order to help the refugees. And a stronger host community will also help the refugees coming in. And I saw that I think there's a dynamic where they eventually strengthen each other. Then the other part is community-based work. We make sure that the community actually captures the tools and the skills. That is very important. For example, when you talk about mental health and psychosocial support, that's not necessarily something that we have to do, but that really something eventually can be done by the community itself, by leaders, by elders, and whatever. And I will say that a lot of our monitoring or of our evaluation actually goes by the self-reliance index, which is an index that we really use in order to really see has our program been successful or not, and we use that self-reliance index. I also want to answer your question, which is a really good question, and I let you know why. Look, HIAS is a resettlement agency, and one of our programs is the Lautenberg program, where we work in Vienna and Zagreb, where we bring religious minorities from Iran to the US. They come to Vienna or to Zagreb, they receive a visa, and from there they go on. That includes Baha'i, that includes Jews, Mandaeans, Zoroastrians, and so on. But you're absolutely right that is only bringing them to the US. But what happens once they are in the US? And I often say that resettlement to the US is slightly romanticized. It's not that once you arrive into the US, all your problems are solved. And this year is actually really interesting because we have a presidential determination of we should be able to bring 120,000 refugees to the US. I just got the new number today. We just passed the 80,000. Now, why is that? because resettlement agencies in the US do not have the capacity to absorb so many refugees because the funding that we receive from the US government is not enough. Housing prices are nuts in the US, right? And think about, you know, we would receive, I think it's about $2,750 per person for 3 months. And when you resettle that person in the Bay Area and it needs to cover all the costs, it's almost impossible. And that's again where advocacy comes in very strongly. I think we have done a great job this year together, resettlement agencies and others in doing that advocacy. And we were just informed, I think 2 weeks ago, that this funding will be raised. So the per capita funding per refugee will be raised in the next fiscal year, and I think that's an example. So it's all about advocacy and putting the pressure on the governments.
Yes, thank you for all those questions. I won't be able to answer them all, and I may have neglected at the beginning to mention that Islamic Relief is a humanitarian development and advocacy organization, and yes, the advocacy is critical. As much as I'd like to talk about some of the livelihood and retraining programs, I just want to say a lot of that is advocacy as well. You know, reskilling refugees that come, or making sure that their education and certifications might be transferable without a very long process. In Virginia, which is where we are, we actually have a shortage of medical doctors, especially in some of the rural areas. And you know, we've been able to work with local government in order to take some people who are coming in that already have some of these training and skills in their home countries and be able to move those, which comes to that question of political will. And I think the MC mentioned it at the plenary just earlier, that even if the national government has an interest in refugees, even if there are these numbers, there are capacity issues, and then there are the local, you know, the local level governments that might not be as receptive. So you might be getting refugees in some areas and not into other areas. And I think that's somewhere we have to work. In terms of education, you know, interestingly or sadly, we had that convergence and confluence of COVID and conflict and children, right, all coming together at the same time, which had us being a bit more imaginative and creative about some of our programming and how to educate children. One of my favorite projects, and I've talked about it quite a bit, and we did some programming with UNICEF to talk about it, was we had a bus in Jordan, and it was for Syrian refugees that were living in camps, and this bus would actually like drive to the camps and pick up the children. And they learned in the bus because the bus was decked out with some technology and Wi-Fi, and they were able to access some of their education that way, because we don't want these children to be interrupted in their education. These are lost generations. I think a couple of people have already said, you know, when they don't have that. And then finally, for the last thing around, you know, how are we educating? That is one of the reasons that we put together this booklet, and I was actually approached by a Brazilian Muslim faith leader here, whether we had it in Portuguese or if they could work with us to do some translation, and we need to, you know, look into getting it out more widely. But part of this book was to educate our own communities, both on, how you, the tolerance that we were talking about, and how you treat others, but also for those countries, we're well aware there are majority Muslim countries that have wealth in, you know, the Middle East and the Gulf that are not receiving any or their fair share of refugees, and so it's also to push them through that advocacy as well.
Please.
Bem, eu vou responder muito rápido. O governo brasileiro do estado do Pará e do município de Belém recebe os arais, os haitianos, com programas de recepção legal, onde eles ganham documentações, têm acesso ao SUS, que é um Sistema Único de Saúde brasileiro, que atende qualquer brasileiro e estrangeiro, sem custo extra, a não ser o custo fiscal, e também os imigrantes, uarais, que são os nossos uarais ameríndios da Venezuela, haitianos, africanos, ganham acesso à educação básica com moradias coletivas e também com uma reestruturação legal das leis educacionais para terem acesso também à universidade. Aqueles que não vão à universidade têm acesso à economia popular, à economia solidária, aí inspirada num pensador chamado Paul Singer, que é uma economia de inclusão para acesso a todos. Tá? Sobre a questão religiosa, e aí eu encerro nos meus poucos segundos, o Brasil ele tem uma ética de diversidade religiosa. Talvez seja mais fácil trabalhar a partir do Brasil do que outros países. Trago uma observação de um escritor mexicano chamado Otávio Paz. Ele dizia o seguinte: existe o México desenvolvido e o México pobre. Porém, o México pobre tem mais capacidade política e cultural do que o México rico. Podemos dizer o seguinte: o norte, o brasileiro, tem uma capacidade de articulação política hoje maior que financeira. A nossa maturidade política, econômica e de políticas internacionais está amadurecendo no ponto de vista de inclusão. Então, se há essa apreciação, é pelo republicanismo que amadurece das diversidades religiosas. Muito obrigado.
Just a couple of points. Samantha, very sorry that you and your family have been experiencing persecution, and all the Baha'is in Iran, and for all the communities that have been experiencing persecution, like we condemn all these types of persecutions. On the policy level, as conflicts remains the main driver for producing refugees, they require humanitarian assistance. However, this kind of a humanitarian assistance is not the solution, because always political solutions are the answers for all of these problematic conflict problems. So therefore, UNHCR works in parallel on a humanitarian response, at the same time on policy advocacy level at the state level. This has been translated in different forms within UNHCR. So starting from the XCOM, the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, has annual meeting with all government officials to brief them and advocate for refugee rights. We have the first of its kind, the Refugee Forum. And the Global Refugee Forum is bringing, it's a whole of society approach, bringing governments, influentials, private sectors, NGOs, and this is a very, like at the presidential level, to advocate for refugee issues. We have ONGA, the United Nations General Assembly, every year, where the High Commissioner meets with the presidential people, with all the presidents from all over the world, advocating for refugee issues. And there are so many bilaterals, like the High Commissioner always, he lives in the airplane, always travels to all different countries, advocating for these issues, because we believe that this is the answer. The answer is advocating for policy issues. However, we deal as a United Nations Refugee Agency, we deal with the refugees. And refugees, from our point of view, are those who have been experiencing persecution and they are out of the international border of their countries. So within all those experiencing persecution within their home country, we all the time refer them to local organizations that can support them. And just very quickly, Alvar, thank you for your interest in the research of refugees. Just on the children, very sad fact that 75% of refugees are women and children. And one of the core programs for UNHCR is psychosocial support, because we believe that this is of all the traumas and all the experience that they have been going through, we provide this core programs in our responses, because we would like that, we care about the well-being of this type of the refugee population. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I think we still have time for a couple more questions. If there is anything else, just raise your hand and we'll get the microphone over. Yes.
Hi, I am Elias Shitsnitsky from Religious One Peace. We have a big concern about the xenophobia linked to especially linked to refugees from Venezuela. It's especially at this time, because nobody in the world can dream the future of Venezuela. How can we build a coalition working about xenophobia against refugees and migrants in the region from faith-based organization?
And I think we have one more. Yeah, okay, yeah.
My area, I'm Sherry Steiner with Purdue University, and I also am the historian for the G20 Interfaith Forum. My question, my area of focus tends to be on the environment, on sustainability, and there's a lot of siloing with agencies and policy, and in the interest of we are the environment and to address anthropocentrism. Would there be any benefit, or might it be counterproductive, to add a session or have a webinar that would bring together folks like you with people working on the rights of nature, environmental corridors, things like this? I know here in Brazil there's been some connection that if you promote indigenous health and well-being, you can also protect the Amazon. Well, what about seeing if there might be some synergies? I know some states have passed the rights of a river to address pollution of the river, and environmental conditions are drivers in some of the refugees, but would it be counterproductive? So that's my question. Would it be of help, or would it be counterproductive? Because I'm on the advisory council and we sometimes are allowed to brainstorm. So that's my question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think there's one more, so yeah. Yeah, if you can keep it short.
Yeah, I think I also just piggybacking on that, but then I'll go somewhere else. As I think there is, as you said, there's so many of the drivers, and drivers will increasingly be climate related of refugees. So there's so many connection points. My question is, my name's Andrea Kaufman from World Vision International, and we've been doing a lot of work on faith-sensitive mental health and psychosocial support for children on the move, connected with the work that HIAS and IRW and LWF are doing. And I think it is a unique expression of bringing the rights and faith language and discussions together. And I think we've seen significant changes, even in the last 4 years, in the quality of the conversation and the willingness of different groups to come together. We had a session yesterday that we co-moderated. And I guess my question is, how do we together really catalyze energy around things like faith-sensitive mental health and psychosocial support, where we have these shared interests? There's a huge need. There's huge capacity sharing opportunities between local faith communities who have solutions, who are already providing the psychosocial support, and the needs that UNHCR and other government actors are trying to provide. But sometimes the ability to actually get people in the same room like this, it can be quite difficult.
No, I appreciate it. Go ahead. So let's try to, let's try to keep it to 1 minute per person. Attempt.
Isso, vou tentar. As migrações venezuelanas hoje acontecem provocadas pela ampliação do setor produtivo do petróleo, agropecuário e dos minérios restantes, né? Isso porque a Venezuela tem acordos internacionais para sobreviver, que ela precisa em volume alto de produtos primários. Então, o produtivismo superou qualquer ideia de socialismo ou republicanismo. E essas migrações forçadas ao Brasil têm sido muito dolorosa acolhê-los. Não é fácil, porque também, respondendo à colega, as nossas sociedades ancestrais, quilombolas e ameríndias, também estão sofrendo por essa situação de industrialização e produtivismo na Amazônia. Agora, respondendo a outra colega, e aí fechando, é preciso ampliarmos o modelo ontológico do nosso constitucionalismo. Por quê? Depois da Segunda Guerra, pensamos no constitucionalismo. diante das adversidades culturais, pensamos no neoconstitucionalismo. Agora, temos que pensar no constitucionalismo que também entenda que os entes da natureza devem ser portadores de direitos, como acontece na Bolívia, Peru, onde esse constitucionalismo ampliou muito, e a demanda também dos atiquemecs no norte do Canadá. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. I just want to start with Sherry with the climate issue. So climate's becoming a global issue, but also for refugees, because we have been experiencing refugees become as a result of climate changes. Desertation is one of the main factors that been pushing refugees out in different parts of the world. And we have just recently launched a climate program addressing refugee issues from a different perspectives. So we are mobilizing with different climate actors to address climate changes from one aspect, but also to provide solutions that are friendly with the environment, so we can contribute in response at a humanitarian level, but also being sensitive to climate. Excuse me. With gentlemen, to the question of xenophobia towards refugees, this is the purpose of our engagement with G20. This is the purpose of our engagement with faith-based organizations, because we not only would like to advocate for refugee issues, but we would like to provide solutions. Why? Because refugees are not a burden. Refugees are contributing to the community at so many different levels. Brazil launched a great example of Operation Welcome approach, because they see a value of having refugees within the community, and we would like refugees to be integrated with the community as a driver of support, not as a burden. And Einstein is a refugee, and just recently we have all been celebrating the Olympics, where we saw refugees in the Olympics. So refugees are a big contributors to communities, and this is the call, our call to faith-based organizations to help us find solutions for refugees and bring that hope and smile on their faces and being contributors to the communities.
As an organization, as I said, one part of our projects is regarding refugees. I'd say 1% of what we do is focused on refugees, but 99% of our projects are to strengthen the Christians in the church right they are, how they don't need to move. We try to strengthen them, so prevent them to move from where they are to another places. We just launched a project called Opportunity Africa, so there are projects to help them to be sustainable, to be autosufficient, and don't depend on aid and help. On the past 3 years, we deliver over 80 million meals to refugees, to Christians that are in need of food. So we are trying to make the churches and the people that we help strong where they are, so they don't need to move. And just one little thing is that tomorrow, the 22nd, is the International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion and belief. And we are trying to talk about freedom, about beliefs, about refugees, and I didn't see anyone say anything about that, just to mention. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. To go back to the question that our Baha'i colleague asked us about how do we unburden the NGOs, and then Sherry brought this up around, bringing in universities and other actors. I think it's really important as we're building these coalitions, we're looking at all the stakeholders that can play a part and bringing them together. For the mental health and particularly, one of the things that we've been doing, there are many universities in the United States where they have social work programs, and these students, these young people, want to be culturally and religiously competent. And we have a group that comes every summer. They just visited us a week or two ago, and they go around to all the different faith-based organizations that are servicing refugees to learn more about our communities. So I think this is a wonderful thing to see, because they are of many faiths themselves. And then I just want to go back to the political will too, because like Barnabas, we are an organization where our refugee work is only a small fraction of what we do. Most of our work is our overseas and global humanitarian development work. And I think that political will also needs to be, a lot of our livelihood program is actually trying to support people and families in the places where they are, so that they don't have to cross borders and become refugees, but that they can stay and have the means to support their families in their home countries and in places. Yeah, so that, you know, that is actually our priority number one, and then the refugees would be secondary.
You want to give the last 30 seconds?
All right, I'll be very quick. Look, I think that the question of xenophobia, we already spoke about it. It is really one of the main barriers for refugees to attain their rights, and we do have to do more on that. It also goes back to the question of how can we make sure that religious institutions don't necessarily do the opposite. I think, we do work with religious institutions in terms of empowering Jewish community leaders and activists to challenge xenophobia and promote inclusion. That is one thing we do. We have a big project in Europe where we created 8 interfaith coalitions. And generally, of the question of policy, I do want to state here, interfaith, it's not faith. Interfaith is the most powerful advocacy tool I think that we have. And so we do have to do that also for xenophobia, and especially right now in Latin America, not only because of Venezuelans, Haitians, and also many others. On the question of climate change or environment, it's a complicated one. I think, short answer, yes. I think it would make sense to have that combined, because we are dealing with it. It was already said, it's not only necessarily climate change or environment that causes displacement. Often it is so much hidden, right? There's great research on Cameroon where displacement is kind of referred to conflict, but the question is, why is there a conflict? And eventually it goes back again to the lack of natural resources. And so I think it is very important that we do that. I also think that we, as refugee agencies or humanitarians, could really benefit from the energy of climate activists. They're doing a way better job than we are doing, and I think it would be lovely to combine that. But, and that's the but, is humanitarian agencies are already struggling with doing more with less. And we are, every year I'm trying to scratch the budget just to have our carbon footprint report done every year to make sure that our own carbon footprint is, so it's a bit tough, and I also think we have to be very clear on where we draw the lines, because eventually we do not want to create any sort of competition. But the short answer is yes, it is an important piece. It is an important piece also in terms of the refugee, of the 1951 convention. How can we do, I wouldn't say changes, but how can we go around to make sure that climate change, at least that people aren't returned to a place where they would not be able to strive because of climate change. So that's another big question that we definitely have to tackle. So I do think it would make sense. So much of our work is about that, not always visible, but it is. And as Mohammed has said often, right? It is. It is not, person is not only displaced once. A lot of people are displaced first as IDPs, and then there's a hurricane, and they're already vulnerable, and then they are displaced again. So it is omnipresent in our work, and therefore it would make sense.
It wasn't intended to ask you to do more. Who's at the table?
Yeah.
And one more speaker that's about the environment. It
Yeah.
might energize the conversation.
Yeah.
Bring it back to,
Yeah. Thank you all so much for the excellent questions. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining today, and to all those online, as well as to Interfaith G20 for, of course, continuing to keep refugees in mind. I think we have a lot of follow-up conversations that can be had, and very excited to see the energy, and hopefully even more so soon. So thank you all so much.